Welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS and a very warm welcome to our weekly review of international relations. In international relations, there are times when some sudden development takes place which makes us rethink, is the clock being turned back? Are these events going to change the flow of international relations in a particular direction? Are they going to radically alter equations of power? How is it going to impact on India's national interest, India's foreign policy? As usual, is the crucial issue for us. And what interesting, agitating days we have been going through. First, there was an assassination in Japan, a very peaceful country normally, of a former Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe. Then the popular anguish and anger against the government exploded in Sri Lanka in a very violent manner. And without commending violence, one can say that the people had been left with no choice, and the neighbor next door seems to be tottering at the edge of a precipice of anarchy. Obviously, this is going to have implications for India. While all this was happening, other places on the globe also were experiencing a rise of tension. First of all, there is the issue of Iran, where once the deal, which was supposed to be the joint comprehensive plan of action, which was supposed to be a deal done, it got stuck because of the explosion of the war in Ukraine, and now it seems to be in a perpetual limbo. And Americans have recently imposed some additional sanctions on Iran. And Iran is extremely unhappy about that. It continues with the enrichment of its uranium fuel. And Israel keeps threatening Iran with preemptive attacks. So how is this going to change the geopolitical scene in the Middle East? How is this going to impact on the fate of the Palestinians and the adjacent countries? We also have an extremely interesting situation in Israel itself, where fifth elections in 4 years has been forced on them. Prime Minister Bennett has resigned. Prime Minister Lapid has taken over. And when the elections take place, keeping in mind all the religious holidays in October, what will be the outcome? Will they again have a hung parliament? Will this give an opportunity to the former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is undergoing a corruption trial? Will he come back? Will he make a comeback? And then, of course, the world has been watching with great concern some of the Supreme Court judgments in America. It is not a question that whatever judgments which Supreme Court pronounces in America are only of interest to that country. Take, for instance, the Roe versus Wade judgment, which makes abortions illegal, takes away the right of abortion from the women. This has triggered a debate globally whether any judge, any judiciary, or for that matter, a legislature can take back rights which are now accepted as fundamental human rights. Again, the Supreme Court gave a judgment on the gun issue, the right to bear arms, and the rise of small handgun-borne crimes are rising in America. Semi-automatic weapons are being used. There is hardly a day when there is not a killing in a school, in a church, in a club, and so on. So the president had promised that he would curb the gun lobby. Trump was encouraging the National Rifle Association of America, but Supreme Court seems to have come out on the side of the National Rifle Association and those who want the right to bear arms. Then again, Supreme Court passed a third judgment, which takes away the power from the Biden to enact legislation, which enables him to fulfill his promises about the climate change in the world. All this is going to impact on the rest of the world and our international relations. We'll discuss all this and a little more. The tragic assassination of Shinzo Abe in Japan has raised certain very important questions. It has raised questions about the legacy of Shinzo Abe. It has raised questions about what will be the future of Japan when in a mid-election campaign an assassination takes place. Will it affect the voters? Will it give some time for the French electorate to think about whether their governments have been delivering policies, bringing about policies and implementing which have left nobody dissatisfied, and there will be, of course, questions about the motives of the person who killed Shinzo Abe. But these questions we shall discuss with you a little later. There are certain more fundamental questions which this incident raises about the role of assassination and their impact on international politics. The history of political assassinations goes back to almost before the birth of Christ. You go back to Julius Caesar, and when Julius Caesar was assuming dictatorial, despotic powers, he was assassinated by opponents who thought that they were defending democracy, and some of them became autocratic Caesars themselves. But there is one issue: we are not going that back in past. We are not even going to turn the pages of history to First World War, when an assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand exploded in the First World War. We will come to more recent period. We'll come to more recent period, and often the argument is that it is only the developing nations which are not mature enough where political assassinations take place. Take, for instance, South Asia, where Mahatma Gandhi was murdered in the wake of partition, and on the just after independence, we have the Prime Minister of Ali Khan of Pakistan being assassinated. We have after that a series of assassinations, but they have not been confined to the developing world. There has been an assassination of John Kennedy, there has been an assassination of his brother Kennedy, Bob Kennedy, and then of course when Johnson took over, some people said it was the end of Camelot, it was the end of Young Hopes, it was going back to a more reactionary regime. But without assessing what happened in America, let's stay close to South Asia. In South Asia, there has been murders subsequently of Mrs. Indira Gandhi, before that Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in Bangladesh, and then subsequently Rajiv Gandhi in India. There have been series of murders when the Litte was active in Sri Lanka, of the presidents, and assassinations of leaders of opposition, also by men in public life. There has been a great palace massacre which ended monarchy in Nepal and ushered in the period of Republican rule. But all this, nobody was expecting that something of this kind would happen in Japan. So, first point which we must remember is that no country, no individual, no leader is actually immune to a threat of assassination. Now, once this assassination takes place, the test of the stability of a polity of a country or its society is only one thing: that can it get over the shock, can it resume the threads of its interrupted life and continue with peaceful transition of policies. So, in this context, before we examine what is likely to happen to Japan, how is it going to impact in our relations with Japan, let's see who Shinzo Abe was. Now, Shinzo Abe belonged to a very aristocratic family, you could even call it. It was one of those dynastic elites which has ruled Japan. He himself had been Prime Minister twice, the longest serving Prime Minister since the Second World War. His father had been a foreign minister, his grandfather had also been a Prime Minister. Now, all this is one aspect. It also provides insights into the nature of the Japanese politics, which remains despite almost more than 7.5 decades past the Second World War, when the unbridled monarchy was abolished, Japan was divided, that a certain culture of paternalistic, feudalistic, governance continues there. Some trends were visible when the Crown Prince had married a commoner, and majority of Japanese who have lived respecting their monarch were reasonably unhappy about the way the new bride was being treated. We have this problem elsewhere in other monarchical systems, constitution, whether it is Britain, but we shall not be distracted by that also. What is interesting is that unique about Shinzo Abe was, obviously, he was a great friend of India, one of the first state guests which Prime Minister Modi entertained was Shinzo Abe, and he also was appearing as a countervailing influence when India was dealing with China. So China could not take India for granted and keep turning pressure on in India. But in the larger context, Shinzo Abe was trying to regain the lost glory and get the complete restitution of sovereignty of Japan, which it had lost at 1945. Now, the greatest humiliation for Japan has been that the treaty bound it not to maintain an army. It did have an air force, it did have a navy, but it did have an army, but they were called self-defense forces. It was a bit humiliating. It had to accept American bases throughout the Cold War, and there were restrictions on its sovereignty which were galling. Japan has been a great power, one of the Asian powers which asserted itself on the international arena at the turn of the 20th century, had been there till the Washington Naval Conference and all the way up to the end of the war. Japan also has the only country in the world to have suffered nuclear annihilation of 2 cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And when Japanese were tried for war crimes, this is something which brought India and Japan together. And the Indian judge, Justice Radha Vinod Pal, who wrote the dissenting judgment in the Tokyo trials, saying that all people who had committed war crimes should have been tried, not only the countries defeated. Now, this is one aspect, but the revival of the demand to have Japan restored to its old prestigious place has implications and problems. What happens is that the Japan, when it was on the upswing during the Second World War, had run over almost all of Southeast Asia. Japan then had outlined a plan of co-prosperity, Asian co-prosperity sphere. But the memories of Japanese occupation in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, elsewhere, were not very happy. Some people thought that the Japanese were as exploitative as the erstwhile colonial powers were. But when the Japanese were retreating, when the tide of the war had turned against them, they had armed local people to take up arms against the returning colonial masters, and some of them were successful in throwing them out from Indonesia to Indochina. This had happened. In Malaysia, the emergency which had taken place was again fostered by both sides. When the Chinese were let loose against the Japanese occupiers, and when the Japanese were withdrawing, the people who were against the British took up arms. So all this, from Myanmar to Malaysia to Indonesia, the sentiment against Japan is a mixed one. It is a big Asian neighbor, but the memories of Second World War continue to rankle. There was one particularly bad issue. It was the comfort women, that when the Japanese soldiers were deployed in Southeast Asia, they were being provided rest and recreation through the medium of women who had no choice about entertaining them. These were thinly, euphemistically, prostitutes put in service of the armed forces, and there has been a great demand in South Korea and in some other countries that the Japanese should pay compensations to these. Very few survive. There also, whenever Shinzo Abe went to the martyrs' graves, the cemeteries of the Japanese soldiers and generals, there was resentment in Southeast Asia that he was trying to revive a militarism in Japan. So this is one part which is not often discussed. But the other part is also very, very important, is because how could Shinzo Abe not talk of Japanese soldiers' martyrdom during the Second World War? Because without the feeling of patriotism, there could be no nation state which could ever regain any glorious part at all. So there could be some questions that he should have apologized more, but have the other colonial powers apologized without any qualification? So there's one part. The second part of the legacy of Shinzo Abe is what they call Abe economics. So he was trying to say that the Japanese have to get back their economic primacy. They must also have unicorns. They must also have startups. And he was propagating a particular kind of economic development which would allow Japanese to become economically powerful, become an economic superpower, which it was expected to become in the late 70s. And the problem there is that the Japanese do not have ample natural resources of energy, food, and elsewhere. So what happens is the smaller neighbors like Korea, like Taiwan, etc., have gone ahead in terms of cost benefit of their produce which they are selling, exporting elsewhere. Another problem which we cannot forget is that this Abenomics was a very simplified version for economic development of Japan, because the industry and government have worked very closely together in Japan, and there is a certain inertia to change. There is a conservative society. So whether it is pensions, Japanese are an aging population, and you cannot immediately turn it down to a California and say startups, unicorns can be started in Japan. Many Japanese experts themselves have pointed out that there is we normally tend to focus on Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, and we don't worry about the countryside in Japan, where there is a sizable chunk of young Japanese who refuse to come to Tokyo and Osaka or Kyoto because they think that the life there is quite full of tension, miserable. They would much rather stay in the countryside. But the countryside to develop has to have a totally different model, not unicorns and not this kind of economic regeneration which Shinzo Abe was doing. But the thing which again concerns India more than anything else is that we tend to forget that Taiwan was a Japanese colony till 1945. So when the Japanese were defeated, this Taiwan was handed over to China, which was then under control of Chiang Kai-shek, an ally of the Americans and the British and the Russians then. But since then, the communists expelled him from mainland. So Taiwan became a very problematic issue where even the Americans accept the one China theory because Taiwan is an inalienable part of mainland China. But the Taiwanese, during their long period of Japanese colonization, have followed a developmental trajectory which is very different from mainland China, both in the times of Chiang Kai-shek and since the Maoist revolution. So there is this turmoil and Japan's role in Taiwan, but then Japan, Taiwan and South Korea are facing the same expansionist drive threat from China in this region. So this is something, the lasting legacy of Shinzo Abe is that he is the Japanese Prime Minister who did not only articulate the independence and demand for full sovereignty for Japan, he took steps in this direction. After tsunami, he is the one who proposed the Quad's structure to begin with, revived the interest in it after 5-6 years, and he was the spirit which motivated countries like India to join in without being confrontationist with the Chinese. Since then, AUKUS has relegated Quads to background, but the person who talked of Indo-Pacific, who talked of Pacific, who talked of the Quads was Shinzo Abe. Let's also not forget that the Japanese have been very, very active in India's developmental programs. Japanese Overseas Developmental Agency has funded metros, bridges, highways, major corridors between Delhi and Bombay and Delhi and Kolkata. And I think the Japanese will continue to do so. Nothing is going to change as far as Japan-India relations are concerned. But what happens is, can Japan play as important a role in international affairs as it did during the prime ministership of Shinzo Abe, or even after him, his successor who has served as a foreign minister, Kishida, if he is embroiled in settling domestic political issues at home? Everybody thinks that the LDP will gain a majority, but will it be what would be the role of factions within the party? Now, with Shinzo Abe gone, will they accept the leadership unanimously of Kishida, or would there be a power struggle within the party? And if the Japanese are busy with their own problems at home, will they really be in a position to provide as much momentum, as much thirst, as much inspiration to international relations and subjects of mutual interest, which they were doing before, remains to be seen. The volcano in Sri Lanka had been simmering for quite some time. The people were very unhappy with the dynastic politics of the Rajapaksa family. The Rajpaksas were accused of gross corruption, selling out the country's interest to the Chinese, getting it into a debt trap from which it could not come. At one time, the Rajapaksa family could do nothing wrong. The present president, who has just declared his intentions to demit office, resign, Gota Rajapakse was supposed to be a war hero. He is the one who had annihilated Litte and ended the 27-year-old civil war. But once they returned to power, there was no check on them. They changed the constitution and they mismanaged the economy in a manner that at one time half a dozen Rajapaksa family members were in the cabinet and other positions of power. So it is not only the villains are not only of one family. Now the people are beginning to think that whoever has come to power belongs to a group of elite families, and they keep exchanging power between them, and they keep playing the communal card, Sinhala versus the Tamil, Christians versus the Muslims, Muslims and Christians versus the Buddhists. At times it is a linguistic politics, but the net result is they have mismanaged the economy for a long number of years and gotten into a debt trap, and they have had ego and hubris where they have refused to seek assistance from IMF for a simple reason that IMF would impose conditions on them and they would have to make changes. So the last time when Rajapaksa family came with a massive majority to the parliament in Sri Lanka, they cut down taxes, they experimented very without any thought about organic farming, and they did not realize that when the COVID hit them hard, that the tourism industry was almost ruined, which was a major foreign exchange earner for them. So they complicated their life for themselves. To be fair to the Sri Lankan governments, past and present, it must be considered that a very vast amount of resources was spent trying to fight the Litte and to defeating them. But the economy could have followed a path of revival and recovery had the government been frugal and followed economic policies which were more egalitarian. But if one family was going to benefit most of all, if all the economic development was going to take place in Hambantota, the pocket borough of the Rajapaksa family, the airports were built there, the naval base was given to China, the ports were built there, no ships visit that, no planes land there, nobody uses the massive highways, 8-lane highways which were built there. They were only white elephants as showpieces. So Mahinda Rajapaksa and later his brother Gota Rajapaksa could tell the people that, look, this is what we are doing. Sri Lanka is marching ahead. But Sri Lanka was not marching ahead, it was getting into a debt trap, and now it has blown in their face. So we come to the present. Now what has happened? Till last week, what was happening is that their foreign exchange reserves had come down to an extent that they just had enough for a day or a couple of days fuel for the whole country. There was no transport, the offices were working for 4 days a week, people were advised to work from home, government servants were advised to grow vegetables and crops in the kitchen gardens if they had any plot of land. There was no power supply, it was interrupted, medical services were being interfered with. Now, all this had brought the people to the roads and they were peaceful, but what happened in the last week was absolutely dramatic. Tens of thousands of people marched into the presidential palace and occupied it. They were seen, the videos showed people swimming in the swimming pool, sitting on the chairs where the office was there, and gently raising slogans and saying, go, Gotabaya, go. And it was like the scene of a fall of Basti and liberation. Liberation. Now again, as if this was not enough, the president was whisked to a safe place by the Navy, like his brother had been earlier whisked some time back. The Prime Minister was whisked to a safe place, unknown place by the Navy, and again, the Prime Minister's personal house, residence in an elite locality was burned down. Now this seems to be a pretty disastrous situation, because what happens is that the president has been forced to make a statement, not directly but through the speaker of the parliament, that he is going to demit office after 3-4 days gap, and he wanted this respite for 3-4 days gap to have a smooth transition of power. But it is difficult to imagine what would be the smooth transition of power. Who would he hand over the power to? Because when Ranil Wickremesinghe was appointed the Prime Minister, there was some hope that this man, who had never been the President but who had been an experienced enough Prime Minister, who had good contacts with all political parties, who had dealt with the IMF, would be able to get a tranche of relief from IMF. It is not going to happen in a hurry. Now he also is a tainted party because of his association with the Rajapaksa family. Had Gota Rajapaksa also gone out when Ranil Wickremesinghe was appointed the Prime Minister, perhaps the damage could have been controlled. But there is no question of ifs and buts at this stage. Ranil Singhe is seen as much of a villain as the Rajapaksa family. Now, the Rajapaksa says that he's all in for an all-party government. But what does the all-party government mean? Can it mean that their own party, the Sri Lanka Purmuna party Podujana Parmanna can also be a part of this government? No way. The people are not going to let any of the tainted Rajapaksas to be part of this government. Similarly, Ranil Wickremesinghe is tainted. So who's going to run the government? There seems to be a power vacuum, and as long as there is a power vacuum in Sri Lanka, how does the aid come to Sri Lanka and get distributed and channelized? There could be India, a very friendly country, say that, look, we will be unstinted in our help and give $2-3 billion right away. China might try to match the thing. IMF is going to be very reluctant to send any aid where he doesn't know who's going to receive the aid and how is it going to be utilized. So this is the most dangerous situation in Sri Lanka. What happened, the run-up to the fall of the President's Palace and burning of the Prime Minister's house was that despite the fuel shortage, the people forced the buses to take them to Colombo. They commandeered the trains to come to Colombo, and the soldiers fired tear gas, they used water cannons, but it seems to be a situation where the soldiers, the policemen know that the people think that they are on their side. They cannot be protectors of a corrupt elite for anymore. Now, it seems to be that Navy may have saved the president and the prime minister at the moment to avoid anarchy, but sooner or later they will have to face facts. It is not as if that the Rajapaksas, the Gota Rajapaksa himself was a lieutenant colonel in the Sri Lankan army before he retired, became an IT entrepreneur in America, then came back and became the defense minister to crush the elite years later. But the fact is that he had in past also declared emergency and given army the charge to run these things. But how can the army run the nation when there is no fuel, when there is no food, when there are no medicines, when there are no planes landing? Their only hope is that tourism should be revived. But as long as the country is going through this death throes of anarchy, who is going to be the tourist to land up there in a country almost on the verge of collapse and implosion? Now, this is the problem for India. India has already burnt its fingers in past, when India, with all good intentions, sent an IPKF and became the villain of the peace ultimately, and Indian soldiers lost their life. India lost a lot of goodwill in Sri Lanka. It was accused to be a partisan force in favor of Tamils. All these risks continue in the present situation also. India has to see to it that China doesn't exploit this situation. India should be more than generous without any expectations of a return to have financial assistance, the food assistance, the vaccine assistance, the energy assistance. But how does India do that? The situation appears to be even worse than in Afghanistan at the moment, where the Taliban at least control power, they control the capital and the power. Here in Sri Lanka, there seems to be a state of power vacuum. Now, of course, it is said in physics that nature avoids vacuum and somebody will fill the vacuum, but who will fill the vacuum? Can there be a coterie of technocrats who risk everything, but will they have the experience to run the government? Will the rest of the world trust them? This is where the greatest challenge for India lies at this moment. Whenever we talk of Iran, we talk about Iran with borrowed lenses from the West. We talk of the nuclear threat which the Iran poses for the non-proliferation. We talk about the enrichment of the nuclear fuel by Iranians. We talk of the Israeli attacks on the nuclear installations of Iran. We talk in terms of assassinations of the nuclear scientists in Iran. We talk in terms of the dogmatic, fundamental Islami mullahs in Iran, which are retarding, quote unquote, the progress of the nation. And we talked in terms of economic sanctions which have been imposed on Iran. Now, unfortunately, all this focus distracts us from a very major realization that Iran is a very major country in the region. Iran's land boundaries are shared by 7 countries. It shares a land boundary with Pakistan, it shares a land boundary with Iraq, it shares a land boundary with Tajikistan, it shares a land boundary with Armenia, it shares a land boundary with Azerbaijan, it shares a land boundary with, at a pinch, with Turkey. Now, the problem is that it also has maritime boundaries it shares with very many countries. It shares with Oman, with UAE, with Bahrain, with Qatar, and also the problem is a little distance removed with Saudi Arabia if you talk of the Gulf of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. Now, the point is that Iran is a country of 80 million people, a vast land mass, and these shared boundaries create problems but create affinities also, because there is Iranian Persian speaking population on both sides, there are ethnic minorities on both sides of this international border, and let us not forget that Iran, forget about American enmity with this Iran ever since Reza Shah Pahlavi was thrown out and Islamic Revolution was successful. Carter failed to save the diplomats despite the use of force. All this is almost past ancient history. Almost in half a century, the Iranians have succeeded and holding their own fortress against the rest of the world. Call it Islamic resistance, call it Islamic revolution. They have survived the Iran-Iraq war, they have survived American sanctions. Now, the interesting part is this, that Iran is also a very important oil producing and exporting country. Now, the American sanctions have crippled it, nobody can deny that. But the sanctions have not succeeded, that also can't be denied. Now, in recent past, there has been news item that there has been popular unrest in Tehran, in other cities like Isfahan, in Qom. But the point is, are these parts of the psychological warfare to put pressure on Iran to say that the hold on power of the Islamic mullahs is crumbling? Is it to say that Israel's threat to have a preemptive strike on Iran should break their strength of will? They should make a compromise? There was a very interesting prospect of the joint comprehensive plan of action to negotiate the withdrawal of economic sanctions on Iran and Iran making a commitment to reduce its enrichment of the nuclear fuel. But this has not happened because Trump imposed additional sanctions, and very sadly, in recent past, this deal which was supposed to be done and signed in Vienna suddenly was interrupted for two reasons. A, it was leaked that the Iranians want the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to be taken off the list of terrorists, and also Israelis said that they would not accept under any circumstances Iran getting a nuclear weapon. They have enriched their fuel up to 20%, from 20 to 80 is very easy. Nobody talked about Israel's illegal attacks on the installations of a sovereign nation, or assassination of its scientists, or Iranian Revolutionary Guard generals elsewhere where they were active. The Americans used drones to kill him. Now the problem is that Iran has over the past few years shown that it can stand up to the American sanctions. They have found a way to export their oil. The Chinese can buy it, they can use the Chinese cooperation, send it all the way up to Venezuela and Peru. Now what happens is the Americans should realize the limits of their power, and they should think that a country which is a civilizational nation state, which is not lacking in oil and gas resources, which is technologically a sophisticated nation state, and it cannot possibly be brought to its knees by sanctions. And the Americans, unfortunately, President Biden recently has imposed another set of sanctions on Iran, trying to browbeat it into a submission. So we think that the Iranian situation is worth watching in quite some time, because Indians, under the influence of the Americans, first of all cut down our import of oils from Iran. Then we took too much time to develop the Chabahar port, and the Chinese stepped in, and the Iranians have moved over towards the Russian-Chinese side in this conflict, especially more so after the Ukrainian war. So the relationship, the Israelis have tried to build up their relationship with UAE, with Saudi Arabia, trying to normalize it, and also trying to normalize their relationship with Turkey, which has been fraught, to put Iran in an isolation. But can you put anybody in an isolation if it is a country which is a producer of oil? It can have alternative resources for its oil market. It can also deal in currencies other than dollars. So you obviously are subverting your own system by exorcising so many people, expelling from the system. Iran, Russia, China, they haven't done it as yet, but China is very squarely on the side of Russians and the Iranians. So it is difficult. The strategic significance, as we said, how many land borders it shares, how many maritime borders it shares, and if you keep the Caspian Sea in mind, it also, through Caspian Sea, there is a way which touches the Russian borderland. So Iranians cannot be wished away. They are a major power, and they have survived the American pressure and the Western sanctions for almost 4 decades and more, and it is not likely that they will succeed. So Indians have to recalibrate their policies towards Iran, not only Iran, but Iran, Gulf region, because Iranians have not been very easy to live with as far as the UAE and Saudi Arabians are concerned. They have been aiding Hezbollah in Lebanon. Their missiles have been hitting targets in Abu Dhabi and in Saudi Arabia. So I think this confrontationist attitude of Iran is going to continue till West does not make concessions which are genuine, not symbolic, and should not add on to provocation. Once this happens, then we can discuss what is happening in Iran elsewhere. Maybe there is a genuine unrest, maybe there is genuine growing seeping unpopularity after all these decades against the regime, which is strictly religious. But then we must not forget that almost 2 generations have been born and grown to adulthood who have not known the Shah's Iran at all. So there is, if you vilify, demonize the enemy, the Israelis are Zionists, the Americans are capitalist supporters of Zionists, and there is a devil. The devil is on the both sides. For the Americans, the Iranians are the Islamic devil. From Iranians, the Americans, the Israelis are the Zionist devils. So there is these perceptions which are important. It is important for India not to be swayed by lenses borrowed from others. We have historic ties with Iran. It doesn't mean that we will have always a coincidence of interest and overlap of our strategic interests also. But we should try to look at all the powers, all the countries which matter in international relations from our own perspective. Nobody had thought that the government of Israel, led by Bennett, Prime Minister Bennett, would last a very long time. It was a very uneasy coalition. It had parties from extreme right, extreme left, and it also included a leader of the Arabian Party for the first time. But the sad part is that nobody had expected that Bennett would resign so soon, less than a year. He's the shortest serving Prime Minister of Israel by now, and the power would transit to Prime Minister Lapid now. Now, Prime Minister Lapid is very interesting, and before we come to Prime Minister Lapid, we must note that this is the 5th election being forced on the Israeli voters in 4 years. And whenever the Israeli voter goes to vote now, to ballots this time, its interest gets decreasing all the time. They realize that every time no party is going to get a straight majority, the coalitions are going to be formed very opportunistically, no policies will be implemented which concern either security or rehabilitation of refugees. Refugees, not the Palestinian refugees. Refugees meaning the resettlers from Israel, Jews, into the territories, into the lands which were once allocated to the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority. So the security is always under threat. The lives of these people who are settlers or the Palestinians who are forced to live a subhuman life, who have been denied whatever had been promised to them in various international agreements, is one thing. But the Israelis also are getting tired. At one stage it was said that the younger Israelis want a peace dividend, but nobody is talking of a dividend of peace now, because they probably have reconciled to the fact that there is not going to be a lasting peace. They are going to live a life under a siege mentality. The young will serve as a compulsory draft in the army. They will come back, they are well-meaning, but they have learned to live with daily exposure to violence, either by a person, a Palestinian, who would hack an Israeli citizen, innocent citizen, to death, or shoot them dead, and the police will retaliate in very large measure. The rockets will keep falling in the Israeli territory from Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, from the Palestinian part of the land. Again, there will be crushing retaliation by the Israelis. Now, all this is one aspect. But what happens is that Lapid is an extremely interesting person. He was a high school dropout. He was a self-made journalist. He is centrist. He is supposed to be a liberal. But can anybody, a centrist or liberal in Israel, follow a policy which provides justice to the Palestinians and the Arabs and can be satisfied? The real question is that can any Israeli leader, centrist or liberal, afford to take the risk of pushing the envelope too far? The last one who did that was Prime Minister Rabin, who wanted to give a fair deal to the Palestinians. He was assassinated by a right-wing extremist in his own country. So this risk continues to be there very much in Israel, despite it being a very tight security state with a great intelligence apparatus and so on. Things have happened there in the past, and Rabin was also a past general in the Israeli army. So the other set of questions which come: what is likely to be the outcome of the elections in October after the religious holidays? So if again a hung parliament is there, what would happen? But Israeli voters are worried, even with the greater calamity, that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, ex-Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, is currently facing grave charges of corruption. He is visiting courts and he's in the dock as an accused. If he's convicted, that would be a different thing. But he's a man like a cat with 9 lives, and people don't put it past him that he might exploit the hung parliament situation to his advantage and yet bounce back to the position of the Prime Minister of Israel. That is a calamity which nobody wants to happen again, because he is accused not only of corruption but subverting the rule of law and living as a tyrant and a dictator, taking advantage of whatever was happening. He was helped to a very large extent by another very unpredictable tyrannical autocratic ruler, there's the President of the United States then, President Trump. But the real problem is that Israelis sooner or later will have to learn to live with their Arab neighbors and the Palestinians. They are restoring their ties with the Gulf countries, with Saudi Arabs, with Oman. Why can't they start doing it in the neighborhood and not make them feel that they are enemies? And as long as this confrontation continues, Israelis cannot live in peace by themselves. They are a small island surrounded by a turbulent sea where the Arab population is the largest. The problem here is that the politics of Israel is governed not only by the Zionist hardcore, it is also influenced to a large extent by the Zionist supporters in the United States of America, the capitalists, the industrialists, the people who influence media. So the American public opinion and the American domestic politics also comes to aid of the Israelis and puts them, for American security interests, in the forefront of this conflict with either Iran or with Arabs one step removed. India's relationship with Israel have become warmer and closer in the past few years. Israel is one of the important suppliers for India's arms. We look forward to technology transfer in other fields with Israel. And Israel was considered to be a pariah at the height of the Cold War for India. India was supposed to be a natural ally and friend of the Palestinians and the Arabs. Much has changed since. But wisdom lies in the course of action, where India tries to balance its relationship with Israel and the Arab world, and Palestinians, of course. Now, Palestinians can't give India much, but what India has to look forward to is that India has close relationship with Gulf countries and Saudi Arabs. And India has close relationship with Israel. Israel is trying to mend its fences with these countries, so the problem areas are not going to lie here. The problem areas are going to lie in the zone of conflict in the Palestinian Authority occupied territory, which was given to them, not occupied. They have not fully occupied it ever. And Iranian-Israeli confrontation, where India has to tread carefully. This is all we have for you this week. We had thought that we would deal with you a lot other subjects. We'd talk about Roe and Wade, we would talk about climate change, we would talk about the right to bear arms, what are fundamental rights, how they affect such demands elsewhere in the world. But I think the unexpected traumatic events which have taken place this time leave little time to explore in depth subjects which deserve closer attention, like the climate change and how the Supreme Court of America's decision on climate change is likely to impact on the rest of the world. We have to review the deterioration in the politics of climate change and the global warming all over the world in greater length. So we would advise you to focus on what we did this time. Think in terms of politics of assassinations. Think about the legacy of Shinzo Abe. Think about, is that legacy of Shinzo Abe not questioned in Japan, or is there opposition to it? We don't know whether he was assassinated because of any ideological opposition or where there was a person who was not mentally balanced who perpetrated this crime. But where the linkages become important is this man killed Shinzo Abe with a homemade gun-like weapon. Now, this is the other extreme of the right to bear arms. There are strict armed laws in Japan, but it did not save the ex-prime minister from being assassinated because of this. So was there a security lapse? What are likely to be the impacts? But how much of the Shinzo's legacy relates to strategy, Quads, relates to economic regeneration of Japan, reassertion of Japan's sovereignty, and do these challenges occur elsewhere? Equally important is to keep revising whatever is happening in Sri Lanka. It is not easy for Sri Lanka to get out of this mess. And the power vacuum, how it will be filled, by whom it will be filled, and how the rest of the world would respond to Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, in international relations, there are many cases where a long drawn crisis is forgotten very easily. Even the most heart-rending humanitarian crises are forgotten. People can get over the genocide in Cambodia under Pol Pot. People can get over millions of people dying in Sudan or Saudi Yemen. People can forget about these miseries of refugees like Rohingyas, which the numbers touch millions. So the Sri Lanka is a country close to India, not only geographically, but emotionally, culturally, economically. So we cannot afford to take our eyes off Sri Lanka, but nor can we take initiative which is likely to be misunderstood. So if we keep these things in mind, we will be in a better state to analyze developments elsewhere, what is happening in Iran, what is happening in Israel. Till we meet again next time, thank you and goodbye.